When I was a kid, I always wanted to join a youth adventure group. Back then, these groups were still admired for teaching outdoor skills and building character. I think I was around 12 years old when I finally convinced my dad to let me sign up. He was hesitant at first because, in his homeland, such groups were often tied to strict militaristic activities for children. I asked the group's organizer to meet with my dad, and after a long conversation filled with questions, his concerns were put to rest. With that hurdle cleared, I officially became a member of a junior scouting club. However, my excitement soon dimmed when I realized that the club wasn't what I had hoped for. The leader of our troop was an overly nervous woman who didn't seem very passionate about the program. It was a letdown for me. About 7 months later, there was a glimmer of hope. A leader from a nearby district invited our troop to join their group for a camping weekend. This was exactly what I had dreamed of when I signed up. I used to go camping with my family, but after my parents divorced, those outings stopped altogether. That Saturday, we were picked up early in the morning and driven to the campsite. Our group was small, only about 9 kids. Once we arrived, the leader gave us a rundown on how to set up our tents. Each tent was supposed to house 2 boys, but since we had an uneven number, I got to set up a tent for myself. The leader guided us and everyone got to work. Some of the kids needed help, but we managed to pitch all the tents without much trouble. The morning was spent learning basic first aid and safety skills. I got paired with the leader and became the example for the rest of the group, which meant I spent hours wrapped in bandages and carried around on a makeshift stretcher. Turned out to be both fun and educational. Afterward, we had a quick lunch and took a short nap until about 3 p.m., when it was time for archery practice. I had been looking forward to this the most. Ever since watching an adventure movie as a child, I'd fantasized about using a bow and arrow. The leader gave us a quick lesson, emphasizing the importance of safety, though it was clear most of us were too excited to listen carefully. I got to go first. As I pulled the bowstring back, I crouched dramatically, imagining myself as a character from one of my favorite movies. The leader quickly corrected me and told me to stand properly. Although it took away some of the thrill, watching the arrow hit the target still gave me a rush of excitement. The rest of the kids took their turns, and then we practiced on our own. Everyone was having fun, joking, and trying to outdo one another. That's when the accident happened. A boy named Brian had just knocked an arrow and was talking to another boy, Alex. Brian had the bow partially drawn when Alex said something that made Brian turn toward him. Somehow, Brian let go of the string. The arrow hit Alex in the chest, going in about 6 inches. Chaos erupted. The leader shouted for the first aid kit, and Alex was gasping for breath. There wasn't much anyone could do except try to calm Alex and pack the wound area. 2 kids were sent to run to the ranger station about half a mile away, while the rest of us stood frozen, too shocked to move. Brian paced back and forth, muttering apologies until the leader sternly told him to sit down. An ambulance arrived about 25 minutes later, though it felt like an eternity. The trip ended abruptly, and we hurriedly packed our things. On the ride back, Brian broke down in tears. His cries were heart-wrenching, and I still remember them vividly. To me, it was clearly a tragic accident, but some kids later spread rumors that Alex had insulted Brian, and the arrow was shot intentionally. Only Brian knows the truth, and he's never spoken about it. The next morning, I found out Alex had undergone surgery, which was successful. The arrow had punctured his lung but missed his heart by less than an inch. He made a full recovery. Brian, relieved beyond words, formally apologized to Alex a few months later. Alex accepted the apology, and from what I heard, he never held any grudges. As for me, the incident marked the end of my scouting days. When my dad heard what had happened, he pulled me out of the program immediately. But I didn't mind too much. I ended up picking up skateboarding instead, which surprisingly turned out to be much safer. The events of this story took place during the summer of 2007. For years, I had been exploring the hiking trails of a nearby national forest. The drive, which took a little over an hour, was as smooth as ever. After parking near the visitor center, I informed the park ranger of my plans. With a final check of my equipment, I set off on a 2-mile hike to my usual campsite. Little did I know, someone's life had taken a tragic turn, and my own path was about to change forever. My interest in the outdoors began after the events of 9/11. While I wasn't directly impacted by the tragedy, I had lost someone very dear to me. We had been close during our university years, but drifted apart over time. Social media eventually reconnected us, and we were planning to meet over the holidays to explore rekindling our relationship. However, before that could happen, I received news of her sudden passing. The loss shattered me, and I spiraled into despair, even considering ending my own life. I packed a bag and went to a remote spot, intent on solitude. But when I arrived, the serene beauty of nature unexpectedly brought me a sense of calm. Though my grief was immense, the tranquility of the outdoors provided a space for healing. It became my sanctuary whenever the weight of my emotions became too much to bear. Returning to the summer of 2007, my trips into the wilderness had become routine. The first evening of my camping trip was uneventful. The next morning, after a quick breakfast of granola, I decided to hike deeper into the valley. These outings often yielded interesting stones or small artifacts for my growing collection. As I navigated a steep descent, a sudden glimmer of light caught my attention. At first, I couldn't determine its source, but another flash soon blinded me momentarily. When my vision cleared, I noticed arms flailing roughly 50 feet below me. I hurried down the trail for a better look. There was a narrow ledge nearby, and I leaped onto it. However, the rocky surface crumbled beneath me. The fall seemed endless, and I braced for intense pain. Fortunately, I landed on a softer patch of dirt, having fallen only about 20 feet. Winded but mostly uninjured, I caught my breath and remembered why I had come down in the first place. As I tried to stand, I realized my left foot was wedged between two large rocks. It took considerable effort, but I managed to free myself. Once on my feet, I searched for the person I had seen. Not far away, I spotted a woman lying almost completely still. Carefully, I made my way down to her. At first, she seemed lifeless, but then her lips moved faintly. Kneeling beside her, I gently asked her name. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave a faint smile. "I thought you weren't going to make it when I saw that ledge collapse," she rasped. "I'm sorry, but do you have water?" I quickly retrieved my water bottle from my pack. Though dented, it remained intact. Tilting it carefully, I let her drink small sips, knowing too much at once could make her sick. As she regained some strength, she briefly explained how she had ended up there. Her injuries were serious, and I knew she needed medical attention urgently. Reassuring her of my plan, I covered her with a fleece jacket from my pack and began the grueling climb back up. The ascent was far more challenging than the descent. My back throbbed, and my knees protested every step. Jogging was out of the question, so I maintained the fastest pace I could manage. By the time I reached the visitor center, it was around 2 p.m. The ranger wasted no time assembling a rescue team. An ambulance later took us both to the hospital, where I spent the night. Around 8 p.m., I saw hospital staff wheeling her in. She was rushed into surgery, and the wait for news felt unbearable. Hours later, I was relieved to hear she was stable. Despite a punctured lung, a concussion, and several broken bones, she was expected to make a full recovery. Her name, I learned, was Sarah. In time, she reunited with her family and went on to build a life filled with love and joy. The last I heard, she was living in Oregon with her husband and 2 children. As for me, my journey toward healing continued. But I am forever grateful that I could be there for her during one of the darkest moments of her life. My childhood was far from stable. After my parents separated, my mother got involved in a series of poor relationships. She even allowed some of these men to live with us. When I was 15, she married a man named Greg, whom she had met at the diner where she worked. Greg was unpleasant and tried unsuccessfully to take my father's place. Although my mother did her best to keep my dad and me apart, I knew he cared about me. Before the divorce, my dad and I often went fishing, camping, and hiking together. Those outings gave me a lifelong love for the outdoors. This connection to nature made my decision to live in the woods almost inevitable. By the time I turned 18, I couldn't handle Greg's behavior anymore. Despite not working regularly, he expected me to wake up at 7 a.m. every day, while he only worked a few days a week. I had been saving money since my sophomore year, determined to leave home. To speed things up, I quit high school during my senior year to earn my GED. My dad wasn't happy but eventually agreed, understanding my reasons. On my days off from work, I liked sleeping in, but Greg wouldn't have it. One particularly bad day, Greg came home angry and stormed into my room, yelling for me to get up. When he seemed ready to hit me, I defended myself, shoving him hard enough to knock him over. I knew this would escalate, so I quickly packed a bag and left, with no plan or transportation. I wandered aimlessly until dusk when I found a patch of woods near the outskirts of town. I set up a small camp, made a fire, and fashioned a bed out of clothes and leaves. Surprisingly, that first night wasn't as uncomfortable as I expected, though I had no plans to stay there long. I figured I'd find an empty building to stay in temporarily, but most abandoned spots had tight security. The only unsecured building I found was controlled by a group of people who used it as a hangout and shooting range. Felt worse than living with Greg. After a week of moving around, I decided to stick to my forest camp. Sleeping directly on the ground wasn't sustainable, so after work one day, I bought a sleeping bag. It was a small investment that drastically improved my nights. I also built a simple shelter using a tarp and lined it with foil to reflect heat from the fire, which helped during colder nights. For hygiene, I used public restrooms and laundromats, sometimes staying overnight to wash my clothes. While my coworkers occasionally commented on my appearance, they didn't press the issue. Eventually, I found a river near my camp where I could bathe. Despite the challenges, I managed to hold on to my job, though the situation wasn't ideal. My camp was near some railroad tracks, which brought occasional visitors. About half a mile away, across the tracks, was a transient camp. I discovered it by chance and used the tracks as a quiet route to avoid police attention on busier roads. One evening, as I returned to my camp, I noticed a fire flickering through the trees. Curious, I approached and found 3 older men gathered around it. After some hesitation, I called out, and they invited me to join them. At first, I just listened to their stories, but eventually, I shared my own. I introduced myself as Matt and said I lived nearby. We talked for hours about life on the move. That night, I tried fortified wine for the first time, a taste I didn't mind but wouldn't recommend. As fall approached and the nights grew colder, I spent more evenings with the regulars from the transient camp. Most were friendly, but one man, an older newcomer named Joe, became aggressive when drunk. One night, Joe attacked me without warning. The others stepped in, giving me enough time to escape. After that, I avoided unfamiliar faces. This worked until someone I trusted turned on me. A young guy named Ryan, about my age, showed up at my camp one evening. He seemed friendly and we quickly bonded. Over the next few days, we spent time talking and sharing stories around the fire. Things were fine until payday, when I let slip that I had some money saved. That night, Ryan cornered me asking to borrow cash. When I refused, he pulled out a knife. Terrified, I lied, claiming I was broke. He didn't believe me, and his expression darkened. Fearing for my life, I turned to run. He managed to cut my arm, but the injury wasn't serious. As I stumbled up the hill, I saw Ryan collapse. Tom, one of the regulars, had been watching and stepped in, wielding an axe handle. He warned Ryan to leave, and Ryan fled. Grateful but shaken, I spent a few more nights at the transient camp before deciding I'd had enough. The next weekend, I searched for apartments and moved into a small one by Sunday night. A few months later, I found a better, more permanent place where I stayed for 3 years. Looking back, I often think about Tom and the others. They weren't what most people would expect from transient life, but even with good company, living rough is not something I'd recommend. Last summer, right after the local travel restrictions were lifted, my partner and I decided to go on a hike in a nearby national park. Hiking had been a favorite activity of ours before we got married, and I was excited to revisit it. Our plan was to hike to a specific mountain lake, camp there overnight, and then return the following day. The weather was perfect, sunny and warm, with dry trails. For most of the morning, we had the path to ourselves. Around midday, we stopped for a break at a designated campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple was already sitting at one of the wooden picnic tables. We asked if we could join them, and soon we were all chatting about our plans and past hiking experiences. The couple told us they were newlyweds on their honeymoon, which thrilled my wife. She loves love stories and enjoyed hearing how they met. She also shared some sentimental bits about our relationship, though I can't recall all the details. After about 2 hours of pleasant conversation, we said our goodbyes and resumed our trek. We reached the lake just before sunset. While my wife prepared a simple dinner and set up the tent, I got a fire going. We spent the evening around the fire, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the quiet of the wilderness. By 10 p.m., we were ready to call it a night. The next morning, I woke up just before sunrise and restarted the fire to prepare breakfast. After eating, we packed up our gear, made sure the fire was fully extinguished, and began the hike back to our car. By mid-morning, we reached the halfway point but decided to keep moving instead of stopping. About an hour later, we unexpectedly ran into the husband from the couple we had met the day before. Oddly, his wife wasn't with him. My wife asked where she was, and he explained with a nervous tone that she had fallen ill the previous evening and had decided to head home early. He said she had insisted he finish the trip without her. Something about his demeanor felt off. He seemed unable to meet our eyes and looked anxious. Still, we had no reason to question his story. As we were talking, another group of hikers approached, and the man excused himself to speak with them. My wife seemed hesitant to leave, but I reminded her we had commitments later that day, and we needed to keep moving. Reluctantly, she agreed. We reached the parking lot shortly after noon. It was busier than when we had arrived the previous day, with several groups chatting and a ranger truck pulling in. We didn't think much of it at the time and headed home. It wasn't until the next morning, during breakfast, that everything took a strange turn. I had just turned on the news when a report about a female hiker's death caught my attention. As her photo appeared on the screen, I froze, my coffee nearly slipping from my hand. It was the woman we had met at the picnic table. I called my wife over and pointed to the TV. She gasped in recognition. The report said the couple had been at a scenic overlook, a place we'd been to on a previous trip. According to the story, they were watching the sunrise when the wife slipped and fell hundreds of feet to her death. While it sounded plausible, something about it didn't sit right with me. Why hadn't the husband mentioned this to us when we saw him later that morning? And why claim she was sick and had gone home? His behavior seemed strange in hindsight. We talked it over for hours, and the more we thought about it, the more suspicious it felt. My wife and I eventually decided to call the local authorities. We told a deputy everything we knew. He thanked us and said someone might follow up with us. But nearly a year has passed, and we've heard nothing. Now, I'm left wondering if we did the right thing or if we should try harder to pursue this. My wife and I can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. Could a crime have occurred? Or are we overthinking what might just be a tragic accident? Should I leave it to the authorities? Or is it worth following up again? Danger still lingers as this story is not yet fully resolved. Most of what I'm about to share occurred roughly 11 years ago. It was around 2010, and I was living with my parents after moving to a new area when I was 12. Not long after settling in, I discovered a wooded area across the road from our house. It became my escape from the bullying at school and the constant conflict at home. This neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the ones who were around were older than me, which only made me feel more isolated. I spent most of my free time alone. One day, curiosity pulled me into the woods, and I quickly realized there was no one else there. That solitude gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in ages. While exploring, I found a cluster of pine trees forming a secluded little space. I claimed it as my secret hideout. I began spending more and more time there. One night, I even fell asleep and stayed until morning. I expected my parents to be worried, but they never even noticed I was gone. After that, I started camping out there regularly. At first, I didn't bring much with me, but I soon realized I needed proper supplies. Since I couldn't ask my parents for money, I decided to earn it myself. I began offering yard work to neighbors, mostly mowing lawns. I had never used a lawnmower before, and the bigger challenge was borrowing one. I snuck out my dad's mower but got caught and punished for it. By then, I'd saved enough to buy a second-hand mower of my own. Once I'd made back some of the money, I biked several miles to a discount store and bought a basic camping set. Excited to try out my gear, I skipped an entire week of school to stay in my hideout. It became an obsession, my escape and the only place where I felt truly safe and happy. For the next few years, I only attended school enough to stay out of trouble and spent every free moment in the woods. The area began to feel like my own private domain, and anyone who wandered in felt like an invader. One day, while heading to the creek to fetch water, I noticed a camper parked near a rarely used road across the stream. Two men were moving in and out of it. They didn't see me, but when I returned later, they were still there, drinking and shooting guns. A stray bullet hit the water near me, and I decided I'd had enough. I ran home and called the local police, claiming I'd stumbled upon the men and that they'd threatened me with their guns. The next morning, a news report aired about a major drug bust. Acting on an anonymous tip, authorities had discovered a mobile meth lab in the camper and arrested the two men. They were held without bail. I felt proud but also deeply uneasy. A few months later, I received a chilling anonymous letter saying, "You've made a big mistake, kid." At first, I thought it was a prank, but when more letters arrived, this time threatening me directly, I was terrified. I couldn't understand how they'd identified me. The threats continued until their sentencing day. Both men, who had extensive criminal records, were sentenced to 20 years in prison. After that, the letters stopped. Gradually, I began to believe the threats were just scare tactics. Life moved on, and I tried to leave the incident behind. But last week, a new letter appeared in my mailbox at my apartment. It read, "Get ready to say goodbye. Your time is almost up." My heart sank. My girlfriend saw it and was alarmed, but I brushed it off as a joke, unwilling to explain the truth. Now, the shadows of my past have come back to haunt me. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid they might harm my girlfriend or our baby. I've considered going to the police, but without evidence, I doubt they can help. So, I'm sharing this anonymously online, hoping to find solace in the anonymity of the internet. All I can do now is warn others to think carefully about their actions, even as kids. Please keep me and my family in your thoughts. In the early summer of 2019, I embarked on a long-awaited camping trip to the eastern part of the country. This journey, which I had been planning for nearly 2 years, would be my first time camping while incorporating shooting practice. The drive to my destination was pleasant, offering a fresh perspective on the landscapes of that part of the nation. When I arrived, I parked my SUV and informed a trusted acquaintance that I had made it safely. Together, we went over my itinerary one last time before I set off for my campsite. The first day passed uneventfully. The weather was mild, and I spent the evening enjoying the stars by the campfire. The sense of freedom was exhilarating compared to the structured routine I was accustomed to back home. The second day was just as peaceful. I strolled leisurely, taking in the surrounding wildlife. Around 2 p.m., I reached the location I had planned to camp at. A quick survey confirmed it was an ideal spot. I pitched my tent and prepared a simple lunch. After eating, I felt drowsy but decided to focus on the main reason for my trip: target practice. Roughly 150 yards from my campsite, I found a dry riverbed that seemed like a safe place to shoot. I set up some metal targets and began practicing. The joy I felt was unmatched, as though I had stepped into the shoes of adventurers from centuries past. After finishing a box of ammunition and reloading my rifle, I heard gunshots echoing from different directions in the hills. Curious and a bit uneasy, I decided to investigate. The shots seemed to come from various locations, which made me apprehensive. Deciding it was best to return to camp, I made my way back, realizing I might not be welcome in the area. To this day, I still question whether returning was the right choice. Back at camp, I began thinking about dinner. The gunfire had stopped shortly after I returned, so I assumed the other shooters had moved on and the rest of the evening would be uneventful. I spent about an hour cleaning my firearms, then relaxed by the fire. Feeling sleepy, I opted for a light meal of crackers and cheese instead of cooking. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I turned in for the night. In the quiet of the early hours, a strange noise woke me. I sat up and peered outside my tent but saw nothing. Thinking it was my imagination, I lay back down. Just as I was drifting off, a terrifying scream shattered the silence. The sound was more chilling than anything I had ever heard. It was soon followed by a woman's desperate cries for help. Paralyzed with fear, I wrestled with my options. Part of me wanted to grab my rifle and rush out, but common sense told me it was too dangerous. I stayed put as another scream and a single gunshot echoed through the night. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, filled with dread, waiting for the first light of dawn. When morning came, the sense of liberation and adventure I had felt earlier was gone. I quickly packed up my belongings and left the area, retracing my route in record time. A journey that had taken over a day to complete before was now finished in under 10 hours. Relief washed over me as I reached safety, but it didn't last long. Guilt began to creep in. I had heard someone being attacked and done nothing to help. The entire drive home, I oscillated between self-reproach and rationalization. One moment, I felt like a coward. The next, I told myself I was outnumbered and powerless. Both feelings were true. Months later, I learned that I had unknowingly camped near the hideout of a criminal gang. Earlier that day, they had gathered in the area to fire illegal weapons and had abducted a female hiker. After hours of torment, they released her into the wilderness, only to shoot her as she fled. Miraculously, she survived, managed to reach a nearby road, and found help. She spent a week in the hospital before being discharged. Authorities eventually apprehended the gang. Most of them accepted plea deals, resulting in lengthy prison sentences. Although I was relieved to hear that the woman survived, the what-ifs still haunt me. I never reported the incident, choosing instead to share my story anonymously. If you think less of me after reading this, I understand. My purpose in sharing is not to seek judgment, but to offer insight. For those who avoid getting involved, I now realize that the guilt of inaction can outweigh the fear of potential consequences. We share this world, and if we can help someone in need, we should. You might be the only hope for someone in their darkest moment. Growing up in Houston, camping wasn't exactly my idea of fun. Why wander into the wild and deal with bugs? The whole notion seemed ridiculous. It wasn't until college that I discovered how enjoyable it could be. During my years at East Texas State University, I transformed from a city enthusiast into someone who could almost pass for a survivalist. However, an incident happened that forever changed my love for nature. As mentioned, the great outdoors and I weren't on the best terms. Before moving to Huntsville for college, I'd constantly walk into spiderwebs, and mosquitoes seemed to treat me like a buffet. By chance, I ended up sharing a dorm room with a guy from Lufkin who grew up surrounded by woods. Some of his friends from back home also attended East Texas State, and they often camped around the state. When spring break rolled around, they invited me to Lake Livingston. Livingston is a well-known spot in the area, famous for its fishing and scenic beauty. I wasn't particularly excited about staying in Houston, and I didn't know anyone going to the beach, so I figured, why not? Having no prior camping experience, I depended on my new friend's advice. I borrowed, bartered, or made do with everything I needed except bug spray. On that front, I splurged and carried a whole can of Deep Woods Off. To my surprise, something incredible happened on that trip. Protected from the bugs, I could finally focus on the experience. When I caught my first fish, I was hooked. The rest of the trip was spent soaking up all I could about the outdoors. From that point on, I joined every outing for the next 2 years. The following summer, I even got to see the Gulf of Mexico for the first time. When not in class or resting, I explored Huntsville's trails and parks. Despite being a college town, it still had a cozy, small-town vibe. I became so familiar with the area that there wasn't a tree or animal track I couldn't identify. During warmer months, I honed my skills at Lake Conroe. Before long, my city friends barely recognized me, but I didn't care. I had found something I truly loved. Even now, I try to stay connected to nature, though it's not the same. During my final year's spring break, many of my camping buddies had either transferred or dropped out. Only a couple were still around, but we'd lost touch. Determined to keep the tradition alive, I planned a solo trip to a renowned national forest in East Texas. I won't name it here because I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from visiting. It's a stunning place, even though strange things can sometimes happen there. I'd heard warnings about overly eager hunters, but this trip wasn't during hunting season, so I wasn't too concerned. After double-checking my gear, I drove over 3 hours in my old SUV and reached my campsite around 4 p.m. I set up camp exactly the way I liked and decided to explore before dinner. That's when I first felt it, that uneasy sensation of being watched. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling lingered. Cutting my hike short, I returned to camp. While bears weren't known to inhabit the area, stories of campers meeting tragic ends still weighed on my mind. The first night passed uneventfully, and the next morning was breathtaking. The air was so crisp and fresh that I couldn't help but feel invigorated. After a quick breakfast, though I can't recall what it was, I packed some essentials into a day pack and hit the trail. The woods were serene, with only the occasional snap of twigs or rustle of leaves. Around mid-morning, I stopped for a break. As my small stove heated water, I leaned against a pine tree and must have dozed off. A mosquito's bite startled me awake, and as I swatted it away, I noticed a brief flash in the distance. It was so quick I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Moments later, a crow cawed loudly, confirming I wasn't alone. While I wasn't scared yet, the experience was unsettling. I continued hiking, but it became clear that someone, or something, was following me. The sounds of rustling leaves grew closer, and a strange, pungent smell filled the air. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. Ignoring my instincts to retreat, I moved toward the source of the smell. Within moments, a burst of dirt and pine needles erupted beside me, accompanied by a deafening crack. Someone was shooting at me. Terrified, I dropped to the ground and shouted, hoping they'd realize their mistake. No response. Paralyzed with fear, I stayed still as the forest sounds gradually returned. Believing the danger had passed, I got up and brushed myself off. The smell lingered, and against better judgment, I followed it again. Another burst of gunfire forced me to bolt in the opposite direction. Shots rang out behind me as I ran, praying for safety. By the time I reached camp, I was exhausted but alive. I hastily packed up and left, not even fully extinguishing my campfire. A reckless mistake I'd normally never make. On the drive home, guilt gnawed at me. What if another camper stumbled into the same danger? Unable to bear the thought, I stopped at a small-town police station about 20 miles away and filed a report. The officer seemed unsurprised, suggesting it was likely an overzealous hunter. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. If it were a hunter, why hadn't the shooting stopped when I called out? The officer assured me they'd investigate, though I doubted they'd find anything. I had no intention of returning to that forest. Back home, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, even kissing the ground outside my apartment. Years later, I came across a story online about a hiker who stumbled upon a hidden marijuana field guarded by armed men. Though I dismissed it as far-fetched, it planted a seed of doubt. Whether the story was true or not, it solidified my decision to stay out of the woods. Life now is much like it was before college, busy, urban, and safe. Though I sometimes yearn for the wild, I know I'll never view it the same way again. For me, the woods remain a beautiful memory, one I'll cherish but no longer revisit.